I would say there are very few events that have aroused such an interest among Marxists worldwide to express their views and analysis more than this one, even like more than when a new war breaks out or something like that. Perhaps because when a new war breaks out, we almost immediately, among revolutionaries, know which side we're on, and it's clear. This can be just as clear, but it takes discussion and analysis. Before I go into it, and Sarah's going to be speaking on parts of this discussion too, I want to make something that I consider like a little prologue so that it sets the stage for knowing how Marxists would approach a situation like this. We know, as Marxists, that ideas expressed in any country, in any society, are the ideas of the ruling class that dominate it. Even if the working class or other sections of the society are infected with reactionary ideas, we know that these stem from the ruling class and its interests to protect its position of power and position of wealth. And so that if we talk about France or Paris or French or something like that, we're talking about French imperialism. We're talking about the rulers, not about the working class, which has a history up and down of struggle, of being repressed, of revolution even. Also, now, as a second point, anyone who has attended Workers' World meetings over the course of years, or even 2 or 3 of them, know that we focus in our discussion, our main attack on U.S. imperialism and on the ruling class of the United States, which is the most powerful ruling class in the world, and U.S. imperialism is like the police of the entire world, protecting and expanding the exploitation and oppression of nations and peoples worldwide. If tonight we are focusing on French imperialism, it's not because French imperialism has suddenly been vaulted into first place. It's because these events have happened in France, and that's where the struggle has sort of taken place over the last week and a half. And the same thing with racism. If there is racism expressed in France, it doesn't mean it's worse than the racism here, which is a country that's built through slavery and the extermination of native peoples, has any more, the ruling class here has any more respect or rights to call itself anti-racist than that of the French imperialists. Okay, with that out of the way, I want to discuss about what happened, before about discussing what happened on January 7th, I want to discuss what happened at January 11th, when the French imperialist bourgeoisie mobilized and manipulated a massive demonstration in all of the country's cities under the phony slogan, I am Charlie, which is an attempt to place all the classes in France under the leadership of the imperialists, and in the imperialist world really in one camp. The goal was to tie the workers to a reactionary modern crusade against colonial people, mostly Muslims, in the guise of a war on terror. And since this was in France, the ruling class added slogans extolling Western civilization and French civilization and alleged freedom of speech, which was supposedly won during the 1789 French bourgeois revolution, which was a very deep, wide-going revolution. Gathered behind these slogans were the heads of states or government of the West European NATO powers, the French President Hollande at the head, with Britain's David Cameron, Germany's Angela Merkel, Italy's Renzi, Spain's Rajoy, etc., all who have recently sent troops, armed reactionary forces, or bombed one or more of Iraq, Syria, Libya, Mali, Ivory Coast, Central African Republic, Afghanistan, making massacres that are 1,000 times greater than what happened in Paris, along with the heads of the lesser European Union powers, including the Polish and Ukrainian reactionary presidents, and Netanyahu of Israel, along with an even more reactionary Israeli politician, what's his name, Leibowitz, who was there fresh from his massacres in Gaza last summer and trying to somehow clean. He wasn't exactly invited by the French, by the way, because he was going there and inviting French Jewish citizens to come to Israel. Now, there was no top U.S. representative there. I'm not sure why, but one can see that having someone like Obama at that changes the whole character of it, and might not have been what either side wanted. But we'll leave that discussion for later. But U.S. imperialism made sure to say that they were with Paris against terror, also against the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. So nearly all the leaders of the imperialist bourgeoisie and their lackeys lined up behind this latest crusade. Charged with the killings of some staff and workers and police at Charlie Hebdo were two French-born and orphan brothers, Sharif and Said Kouachi in their 30s, and they're from Algerian background, but they were French. They were born in France. They allegedly were infuriated by the U.S. did in Iraq, especially at Abu Ghraib prison, and they were upset, they were angry about French imperialist intervention throughout Africa, and fed up with their lives as second or third-class citizens in France. The French police executed two of them in a Paris suburb last Friday, and they also executed a third man, Amedi Koulibaly, who had seized hostages in a kosher grocery. According to a statement from Al-Qaeda in Yemen, the late leader of that group, who I think the U.S. killed in a drone attack, urged these youth to punish Charlie Hebdo for its blatant, blasphemous cartoons. And according to the leader of Hezbollah, the revolutionary Hassan Nasrallah, who has been waging an ideological battle against the Islamic State and against Al-Qaeda, the attack on the editorial office in Paris did more harm to Islam than the cartoons did. I raise all this because I wanted to show you what the political lineup is. A killing took place in Paris. The imperialists, with the collusion of nearly all their media, are using it to mobilize all classes of society, including the workers, into an anti-Islamic crusade in the guise of a war on terror. Our task as revolutionaries in an imperialist country is to win the working class away from this imperialist mobilization and to help our comrades in Europe do the same in their countries, and instead to build solidarity among the working class with the oppressed peoples in the countries under attack and with the Muslim population in the U.S. and Europe who are also under attack. For the rest of my talk, and to contribute to this, I will focus on an outline of the history of French colonialism, especially with regard to its rule in Algeria, since it has such a specific application to this, the events that took place, so that it's an aid in our political struggle and what we want to raise if we're involved in discussions. I'll go into a little detail on this, but not that much. The French fleet first sailed across the Mediterranean, invaded the city of Algiers, and took it in 1830. At the time, Algiers was ruled from Turkey by the Ottoman Empire, which surrendered the port city after a brief battle. However, the indigenous peoples, Berber and Arab, of Algeria in the interior of the country waged a war of liberation against the French and didn't allow them just to run over. So for that, the French sent over an army to conquer them. And to give you an idea of the nature of this, which isn't much different from in most colonial takeovers when there's resistance, I will read a little piece of a letter from a French officer dated March 15th, 1843, which his nephew published later on. Quote, "This is how, my dear friend, we must make war against Arabs. Kill all the men over the age of 15, take all their women and children, load them into naval vessels, send them into the Marquesas Islands or elsewhere. In one word, annihilate all who will not crawl beneath our feet like dogs." Okay, that was, you can see the attitude of the colonial army, and this is not really much different from any colonial army, or if you see the U.S. Army fighting against a native nation in the West or any place in the country here. By 1845, the French military was routinely putting this program into practice. Another general, one thing the army did, they trapped a Berber tribe in a cavern. All the people, the children, the older people, the women who were fighters too, by the way. The women were quite strong fighters in the struggle for liberation. and the men, and they're trapped in the cave. They just burned them out, and they killed everybody. Okay, and this was also shown in a letter, because she couldn't get. By the way, an important thing to note from the point of view of freedom of information and stuff like that, the French army didn't even send the reports that these guys wrote back to the French government at the time for the fear it might fall in the hand of some progressive parliamentarian. So they censored the entire thing. So much for free press. They didn't even have free information for their own government. You know, there were some revolutionaries in the parliament in the 1840s. So this describes how the French ruling class imposed its rule, which was building the empire that was second only to the British. It extended from the South Sea Islands, Kanaki, which is New Caledonia, the French call it, and Fiji, all the way through to Indochina. There was a big war there that the Vietnamese won and drove the French out in 1954. And enormous sections of North and West Africa. I think they had more than 4 million square miles of the earth. And also Martinique and Guadeloupe in the Caribbean, Haiti, which they were also driven out by the first successful slave revolt in that was in 1804, though. That was an earlier period. Okay, fast forward to 1946. The French had just emerged from the German occupation during World War II. The Arab and Berber people in Algeria carried out mass demonstrations and uprisings. They killed some of the settlers. The French army went in to repress them, and a French troop massacred 6,000 Algerians. Okay, so that's already 500 times what was killed on the 7th of January in Paris this year. French imperialism considered Algeria legally to be part of France, by the way. That's not true of all their French colonies, but Algeria they elected people to the French parliament. They were legally part of France, and they especially had a large number of settlers who had come from France and settled in, and maybe were even born in Algeria. 1.5 million, actually, and only about 6 million of the other people. But there was a really serious liberation struggle that started in 1954. You can all see the movie Battle of Algiers, which is available, I think, on YouTube these days. We'll give you an idea of it. And it went on for 8 years. And according to reports, 1 million of the local people were killed, and the French army tortured anybody that was associated with it, including people who were European French, who were revolutionaries and supported the struggle. I mean, I knew someone who died a couple years ago who was jailed and tortured and managed to write a book about it, get sent back to France and escape and write a book about it. But that's because he was French. It got a coverage. There was thousands of Algerians that the same thing happened to that didn't get a chance to tell their story until after liberation. Now, I'm not going to go through the other colonial. As you know, France had colonial wars all over. They did the same kind of stuff. But in some ways, it was more bitter than otherwise in Algeria. And as I said, so many people died. Now, the other story of French history I want to tell you about, because you can say, okay, these things took place in Algeria, they took place in the Third World War, what happened in France itself? Well, in 1961, there was already tens of thousands of people from Algeria who were living in France. As often happens, people from the colonies go and live in the, what do we call them? Not the motherland, no. There's a word, right? The center, yeah, well, then the center, the cosmopolitan, whatever, the metropolis, in the metropolis, right? And many sympathized with the liberation struggle. And the French tried to impose a law in Algeria, impose a curfew on what they call Muslim Algerians, meaning those who weren't the French settlers. So 20, 30,000 people took to the streets in Paris to demonstrate against it, planning a peaceful demonstration, one that maybe they'd have some bumping with the police. But the police were under orders of the prefect, who was named Maurice Papon, who happened to be a Nazi collaborator during the war. But I'll get back to that later. But he told the cops, go in there, beat the hell out of them, kill them, I'll back you up. That was his orders to them, and that's what they did. And they beat up hundreds of people, they threw people off the bridges, and they choked them to death. Anywhere from 70 to 300 people got killed, probably more than 200. The French newspaper Libération reported the official toll straight from what the police gave them: 2 dead, several wounded, and 7,500 arrests. There were more than that arrested, but that wasn't the important. It was all the killed and injured, of course. And the French media, the ruling class media, I'm not sure what the left papers did, but the ruling class media did not publicize it at all, and hardly anybody publicized it. It wasn't until in the 1990s that it started to break out in France. I found out, by the way, because I was looking up, I first learned about it, even not in my memory, through reading a French detective novel where the writer used the events of October 17th, 1961 as a sort of historical background to his story. But I learned while looking it up today that an African-American man also wrote a detective novel with that as the main story. I wrote it here, I think. What did I do here? Yeah, his name was William Gardner Smith in 1963. He said over 200 were killed. Of course, his book was not allowed into France. It wasn't published there. So much for freedom of press and delivery. You want to tell that to somebody? You can tell them that. I haven't read this one. I read the other one, which was a good story. But I just learned about his today, and I will try to find it. It's called The Stone Face. Okay. Now, Papon, the top cop, he was finally arrested for his collaboration with the Nazis. He was put on trial in 1998. Found guilty of complicity in war crimes, and he was sentenced to 10 years, although he was released 5 years later for on alleged health grounds, but he lived another 5 years and died at the age of 96. There's been some films made about this event in Paris, sort of a documentary type film called Nuit Noire, Black Night, and there was also one called, where is it now? Oh, Caché, which I think was available on Netflix, which uses this as background for the film. But I'm mentioning this because it's only very lately that this has entered like the discourse at all in France, let alone here. So it's something that was completely suppressed. It's not something that people think about. Maybe you grew up in knowing about the struggle in South Africa. 30, 40 years ago, you knew about the massacre in Sharpeville, right? Or I don't know, think of something else like that. But this is not something that was part of it. It was suppressed, and that's why I bring it up, because it showed you that the question of freedom of the press depends on what class is using it and whose interests it's defending, and it's never an abstract thing. And the same people who will cheer for it at one point will lie for it on another, and you have to watch out when they're doing it and think about it if you're a Marxist. What is the class interest of the people involved? What is needed now more than anything else is for the working class movements in the imperialist countries to show solidarity with the struggles of oppressed peoples. Those who both as immigrants who are in their own countries and as the for liberation struggles, or to prevent the imperialists from carrying out the wars that they're doing against them. I didn't even go into all the wars that the French imperialism has been carrying out, even in the last few years, against Mali, against Central African Republic, against Côte d'Ivoire, and participating along with U.S. imperialism as part of NATO in Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya. Oh, Libya, the French imperialism led the attack. Probably wanted to get first dibs for Total for access to the oil. So this is what we got to remember. These struggles take place. You got to think not of what's being fed to you by the imperialist media, but what class interests are involved, what's the position of the most oppressed, why are they pounding away with you on this, and then figure out a way to counter the arguments and win over the people and win them over in solidarity with the oppressed people, no matter what the incident of the day happens to be. Thank you. The cartoonists on Charlie Hebdo have a long history, and the magazine does, and it has a whole development, and a lot of them are looked upon by the French left as progressives because of stuff that they've done in the past, illustrating Marxist books and stuff like that. And the French left, like the left through all Europe and through the world, has been deteriorating especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So a lot of this has turned slowly to the right. Then there's the very important question, and I think we should, while being aware of it and of the problems that the French left have, to answer the other part of your question, why they reacted that way to Chris Hedges' article, is that they have a different school, they have a different experience. Look, we have over here is Malcolm X over there, right? He was one of the people who I know taught me the difference between oppressed and oppressor nations, and that was continued by the Panthers, and it also was continued by the leaders of our own party, who spent a great deal of their time, especially talking to white comrades, and explaining what it means to be an oppressed person, what it means to be an oppressed nation, and how to relate to them, and why it's different from a cartoon you draw about one group of people and a cartoon that you draw about another group of people. They could be the same distortions but mean completely different things. And they haven't gone through that. They've gone through other experiences we haven't in the class struggle. I mean, the French ruling class is not cruel only to oppressed nations. They also, when there was a revolution in Paris in 1971, they got the prisoners of war sent back from Germany, 1871, the Paris Commune. They called in the prisoners of war who were their soldiers, and they sent them against the French workers, and they murdered 30,000 French workers in Paris. They were not colonial people, they were French workers who most of them spoke French. There was a few Germans and others in there too. And so there's we should have, I think, a certain humility about, even as we approach the French. I'm not surprised if French comrades that I know heard and understood what me and Sarah said tonight, they would write us off. It's like if it was 2 days after 9/11 and we suddenly gave a speech defending the rights of Muslim people to attack imperialist symbols or something like that. That's the way it would sound to them right now. A few weeks later, there'll be others who will, I hope, be French. I know there's a lot more European communists who are giving answers to this, and it'll start to break it down a little bit, I hope. But I think it's beginning. I know some French bourgeois has. Remember Dominique Villepin? He's a French bourgeois politician who was against the Iraq war. He already has said stuff and gotten himself in trouble speaking on it. But he's a bourgeois. I hope there's somebody from the left too that does it. But that's really what I wanted to bring out and answer to the thing there. It's a tricky question. It's going to be hard to answer it. We're right in what we say about the thing here, and this is the way we should explain it and be in solidarity with the oppressed peoples, always. But if we're going to discuss it with French radicals, left communists, we've got to figure out some way to win them over, too.